When you deal with toxic people, you have to understand something very important. Their entire game depends on deception. They create false stories, false emotions, false intentions, and they wear masks so carefully that most people don't notice the truth hiding underneath. Their survival, their control, their manipulation. It all depends on you believing the mask. They thrive when you can't see the reality of who they are. But the moment you begin to see through it, the moment you recognize the pattern, the lies, the inconsistency, you become a threat. And that threat terrifies them more than anything else, because once the mask is gone, their power is gone too. Think about it. Toxic people aren't strong on their own. Their strength doesn't come from truth. It doesn't come from integrity, and it certainly doesn't come from real confidence. Their strength comes from illusion. They survive by convincing you that you need them, that you are the problem, that without them you won't be enough. They need you to believe the act. They need you to doubt yourself. That's why they put so much energy into keeping up the mask. But here's the reality. No one can wear a mask forever. Eventually, patterns reveal themselves. If you are observant, if you are grounded, if you trust what you see instead of what you're told, the mask begins to slip. And once it slips, there is no going back. This is why awareness is such a powerful weapon. When you can see through the mask, you no longer react the way they want. You stop playing the role they've written for you. If their mask is about playing the victim, you stop rescuing them. If their mask is about acting superior, you stop seeking their approval. If their mask is about love and care, but their actions are full of control and guilt, you stop falling for the contradiction. And the moment you stop reacting, you take your power back. Toxic people fear this because they can no longer manipulate you. They fear being exposed not just to the world, but to themselves. They know if you see through the mask, others might too. Now let me make this clear. Seeing through the mask doesn't mean fighting them. It doesn't mean exposing them loudly. It doesn't mean you have to go into battle. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply acknowledge the truth for yourself. Once you see them for who they really are, their power over you begins to collapse. It doesn't matter how much they protest, how much they deny, how much they attack or try to flip the story back on you. You won't fall for it anymore. And that's what truly shakes them. Toxic people fear people they cannot deceive. And here's the beauty of it. You don't need to argue. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to convince anyone else. You only need to stand in your truth and act accordingly. If you see the mask, you will set boundaries. If you see the mask, you won't keep giving second chances. If you see the mask, you won't fall into the emotional traps. You'll know exactly what game they are playing, and you'll choose not to participate. That quiet strength, that awareness, that clarity is more powerful than any confrontation. Because toxic people feed on energy, they feed on your confusion, they feed on your doubts, and when you are clear, there is nothing left for them to take. The question is, how do you sharpen this awareness? You start by paying attention to patterns, not promises. Don't listen only to words, watch actions. Toxic people often say exactly what you want to hear, but their actions never match. Don't get lost in the performance. Look at the consistency. Look at whether you feel drained or empowered after being around them. Look at whether you feel seen or dismissed. Your body and your intuition usually know before your mind catches up. Trust that. That inner knowing is your shield, and toxic people hate it because it pierces straight through their mask. Once you begin to see through it, don't doubt yourself. They will try to gaslight you, to make you think you're crazy, to make you feel guilty for noticing the truth. They will accuse you of being the problem. This is part of the mask-breaking process. They are terrified because their greatest fear has already begun. You see them for who they are. Stand firm in your clarity. Don't let them pull you back into the illusion. The truth you see is enough. Understand this, toxic people cannot stand in front of someone who sees them clearly because clarity makes them powerless. They need shadows, they need confusion, they need you questioning yourself. When you refuse to play along, when you stay steady and calm, you become the one thing they cannot control. That is why toxic people fear those who see through their masks. It's not about you attacking them. It's not about you exposing them to the world. It's simply about you refusing to be deceived. That truth alone sets you free. And that freedom is what terrifies them most. Toxic people live off intrusion. They live off the fact that you don't say no, that you don't push back, that you bend your will so that they can have control. Their entire influence is built on the idea that your boundaries are weak or non-existent, because without those barriers they can walk right into your mind, your emotions, and your life and rearrange everything to serve themselves. But the moment you create a boundary, the moment you put up a wall and make it clear that there is a line they cannot cross, that's when their control begins to die. That's why toxic people fear boundaries more than anything. Because boundaries are limits, and limits strip away their ability to manipulate. A boundary is not about keeping people out, it's about protecting yourself within. It's about saying, this is what I will accept and this is what I will not. And here's the truth. When you start practicing boundaries, toxic people will resist it with everything they have. They will test you, they will guilt trip you, they will accuse you of being selfish or cold because your boundary is blocking their access. Don't expect them to applaud your strength, expect them to fight it. That's how you'll know the boundary is working. They resist because for the first time, they are realizing that they can't simply take what they want from you anymore. Boundaries terrify toxic people because they mean accountability. When you enforce a boundary, you are essentially saying, I see the game you are playing and I won't allow it here. You are exposing them without shouting, without confrontation, just by refusing to be used. That quiet resistance is powerful. They want unlimited access to your time, your energy, your emotions. They want you available at the snap of a finger. They want you to answer every message, solve every crisis, absorb every insult, and forgive every betrayal. Boundaries interrupt this cycle. They tell them your life isn't theirs to consume. And when you don't cave, when you don't justify or apologize for protecting yourself, they begin to lose their grip. What you have to understand is that toxic people aren't afraid of the word no. They're afraid of what no represents. No represents independence. No represents freedom. No represents a refusal to be controlled. Every time you say no, every time you hold a line, you're reminding them that you belong to yourself, not to their manipulation. This shakes their core, because their strategy relies on you forgetting that truth. If you don't have boundaries, you're easy to control. If you do, you're untouchable. Let's be clear. Setting boundaries isn't easy. It will feel uncomfortable at first. You'll feel guilty. You'll feel selfish. You'll question if you're being too harsh. That's the conditioning toxic people count on. They want you to believe protecting yourself is wrong. But the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. And over time, you stop apologizing for it, because you realize that boundaries are not walls that isolate you. They're doors that protect your peace. They filter out what drains you, so that you have space for what strengthens you. That's why toxic people hate them. They know your peace is the one thing they cannot survive, and toxic people will try to punish you for boundaries. They'll withdraw affection, they'll act like victims, they'll turn others against you. They'll do anything to make you second-guess yourself. Don't take the bait. Their reaction doesn't mean your boundary is wrong, it means your boundary is effective. They're not upset because you hurt them, they're upset because you stopped letting them use you. And if you hold firm, something shifts. They either adapt to your new terms, or they remove themselves, because people who can't manipulate you have no power over you. That's the hidden strength in boundaries. They don't just protect you, they reveal who belongs in your life and who doesn't. Boundaries are also not just about what you tell others, they are about what you tell yourself. You teach people how to treat you by the standards you uphold. If you say you don't accept disrespect but you tolerate it, then your words are meaningless. Toxic people pay attention to your actions more than your promises. That's why enforcing a boundary matters more than declaring one. When you act consistently, when you walk away instead of engaging, when you remain calm instead of arguing, that's when they realize the old tactics don't work anymore. And that realization terrifies them, because manipulation only survives when it has an audience. The strongest part about boundaries is that you don't need to explain them endlessly. You don't need to convince someone why you deserve respect. Boundaries don't need to be justified, they need to be lived. The more you stand by them, the clearer the message becomes. You're not trying to control anyone. You're not punishing anyone. You're simply saying, this is what it takes to be in my life, and if you can't handle that, then you don't belong here. That level of clarity is something toxic people cannot compete with. It exposes them for what they are, people who only thrive when others are unguarded. And here's the most important truth. Boundaries are a form of self-respect. They are you choosing yourself over manipulation. They are you deciding that your energy, your time, your peace are not up for negotiation. And when you consistently live with that kind of self-respect, toxic people don't just fear you, they avoid you. Because they know they can't twist, they can't guilt, they can't control someone who refuses to hand over their power. That's the real reason they fear boundaries. It makes you untouchable in a way they can never break. Silence is one of the most powerful weapons you can use against toxic people, because toxic people thrive on reactions. They live for your anger, your explanations, your justifications, and your defenses, because the moment you open your mouth, they have an entry point. They twist your words, they use your tone against you. They manipulate the story until suddenly you are the one on trial. But when you go silent, when you stop feeding them the energy they crave, their entire strategy crumbles. Silence denies them the fuel they need, and without that fuel, they begin to panic because they can no longer control the narrative. That's why toxic people fear silence more than almost anything. It exposes the emptiness of their manipulation. Think about the way toxic people operate. They provoke. They poke at your insecurities. They create drama out of thin air. They bait you into arguments where they already plan to win. Every word you give them is ammunition. But silence is the opposite. It's not weakness. It's not avoidance. It's control. It tells them, you don't get to dictate my emotions. You don't get to pull me into your storm. Toxic people hate silence because it removes the stage they perform on. Without your response, they are left standing there with nothing to feed off of, and that terrifies them because it exposes just how powerless they are when you refuse to play. Silence is not about suppressing your voice, it's about choosing when and how to use it. Toxic people want you reactive, they want you defensive, they want you emotional, because when you are, they have leverage. But when you stay calm, when you withhold your response, when you let their words fall flat with no reaction, you're teaching them something they cannot handle. You are not under their control. That's why they'll try harder. They'll push your buttons more aggressively. They'll escalate. They'll accuse you of being cold, detached, or even cruel. They do this because silence exposes their desperation. They know if they can't provoke you, they lose the only power they have. It takes strength to stay silent. It takes discipline not to respond when you know you could win an argument, not to defend yourself when you're being lied about, not to explain yourself when you're being misunderstood. But silence is not surrender. It's strategy. It's you choosing not to engage in a fight that has no victory. Because with toxic people, winning an argument isn't winning. If you prove them wrong, they'll change the subject. If you defend yourself, they'll find another angle. If you confront them with facts, they'll twist the story until you look like the villain. That's why silence is powerful. It's the only move that doesn't play into their hands. There's also another layer to silence. It forces toxic people to face themselves. When you stop responding, they are left alone with their own behavior, their own words, their own manipulation. And that is something they cannot stand, because accountability terrifies them. Toxic people avoid self-reflection at all costs, which is why they keep you busy with endless drama. But your silence creates a mirror they can't escape. It makes them uncomfortable because it shows them that their tricks aren't working. And deep down, it forces them to feel the emptiness they've been running from. That's why they often lash out even harder when faced with silence. They are desperate to escape that mirror. You have to understand, silence doesn't mean you tolerate abuse. Silence doesn't mean you sit there and take mistreatment. It means you recognize when engaging has no value. It means you choose to disengage from the manipulation instead of fueling it. It means you are taking your power back by refusing to give them the emotional reaction they want. This is not passive, it's active self-protection. You are conserving your energy, choosing peace, and sending a very clear message: you don't control me anymore. Over time, silence changes the dynamic. Toxic people realize that the old tactics no longer work. They can scream, accuse, guilt trip, or play the victim, but if you remain centered and unshaken, they lose interest. Why? Because manipulation without reaction is useless. They want chaos, they want drama, they want emotional fireworks. Silence gives them none of that. And eventually they will either be forced to change how they treat you, or they will distance themselves entirely, because being around someone they cannot manipulate is unbearable to them. In either case, you win, because silence protects you from the endless cycle of their games. The most beautiful thing about silence is how it empowers you. It gives you space to think before you act, space to see the bigger picture, space to decide whether this person or situation even deserves your energy. Silence is clarity. It allows you to step back, to detach, and to regain control over your emotions instead of handing them over to someone who only wants to exploit them. Toxic people fear that clarity because once you experience it, you'll never go back to being reactive. You'll see through their games faster, you'll disengage quicker, and they'll never again have the hold on you they once did. Silence doesn't just starve toxic people of attention, it nourishes you. It gives you peace in the middle of chaos, strength in the middle of provocation, and dignity in the middle of disrespect. It proves to you, more than anyone else, that you are in control of yourself. And that is the one thing toxic people cannot stand. They want control, but silence makes it clear that control belongs to you. That's why silence is so terrifying to them, because it is the loudest way to say, you don't get to run my life anymore. Toxic people fear when you stop explaining yourself, because explanations are the doorway they walk through to manipulate you. Every time you try to defend yourself, every time you break down your reasoning, every time you give them more details to prove your side, you are unknowingly handing them more material to use against you. They twist your words, they distort your intentions, and they spin your explanations into weapons. That is why they push you to explain over and over again. They know the longer you talk, the more opportunities they have to trap you. But the moment you stop explaining yourself, the moment you realize you don't owe anyone a justification for living your life with self-respect, you cut off their access to control. That silence and explanation terrifies them, because it takes away their greatest tool. Your need to be understood. Toxic people thrive on making you feel like you must prove yourself to them. They question your decisions, they act confused, they pretend not to understand you, and they use that confusion as bait. They'll say things like, I don't get why you do that, or, can you explain what you mean? Not because they genuinely care, but because they want to hook you into a cycle. You fall for it, thinking that if you explain enough times, they'll finally see your perspective. But they never do. Because their goal isn't understanding, it's control. When you stop explaining, you end that cycle. You stop feeding their illusion of authority. You remind them that you don't live your life waiting for their stamp of approval. And that is something they cannot stand. Explanations feel natural because most of us want to be understood. We want people to know we mean well, that our choices come from thoughtfulness, that our hearts are in the right place. But with toxic people, explanations don't work like that. They aren't listening to understand, they are listening to exploit. The more information you give them, the more leverage they gain. If you explain why you didn't show up, they'll twist it into you being selfish. If you explain why you set a boundary, they'll spin it as you being cold or uncaring. If you explain why you walked away, they'll frame it as you being weak. That's why they hate when you stop explaining. Because without your words to distort, they are left powerless. The decision to stop explaining is an act of strength. It's a moment where you finally choose peace over constant defense. It means you've learned the hard truth that not everyone deserves an explanation. Some people don't need to understand you, they need to respect you. And if they refuse to respect you without a lengthy explanation, they were never going to respect you with one. Toxic people cannot stand this realization because it closes the door they always kept open. When you stop explaining, you show them that their opinions don't rule your decisions anymore. You're no longer playing their game of approval seeking, and that makes them feel irrelevant. Notice how toxic people react when you stop explaining yourself. They get louder. They accuse you of hiding something. They say you're being difficult, dismissive, or even arrogant. They'll do whatever they can to pull you back into the cycle, because silence and explanation takes away their power. But if you hold your ground, if you stand firm in your choices without justifying every step, they eventually run out of tools. They can only accuse for so long before the lack of engagement exposes them. That's when the fear sets in. Because deep down, they realize you no longer need them to validate your life. This doesn't mean you never communicate. It doesn't mean you walk around refusing to answer honest questions or shutting out healthy people. It means you become discerning. You start recognizing who genuinely deserves your explanations and who only asks for them to manipulate you. You learn to separate constructive conversations from toxic traps. With healthy people, explanations bring connection. With toxic people, explanations bring ammunition. And once you know the difference, you stop wasting your words on people who will never truly hear you. That wisdom is what toxic people fear most, because it takes away their ability to confuse you with endless debates. When you stop explaining, you also reclaim your time and energy. Think about all the hours you've wasted trying to make someone see your point, trying to convince them of your intentions, trying to prove that you're not who they're accusing you of being. None of it ever worked because toxic people don't want to understand. They want to drain you. When you cut off those explanations, you take that time and energy back. You redirect it toward your goals, your peace, your growth. And toxic people hate that because it shows them they no longer occupy space in your mind. The most powerful part of not explaining yourself is the freedom it gives you. You begin to move differently. You start to make choices with confidence without second guessing how you'll justify them later. You stop shrinking yourself to avoid questions. You stop preparing defenses before you even act. You live with clarity and assurance, knowing that your choices are valid because you made them, not because someone else approved. That freedom is terrifying to toxic people because it means they've lost their grip on you. They can no longer pull you back into their cycle of endless justification. And that means they no longer have a way to control your life. The truth is, toxic people fear independence. They fear you walking in your power without needing them to validate or challenge you. Explanations tie you to them. Silence in explanation severs that tie. It says, I don't owe you my peace, I don't owe you my energy, and I don't owe you my words. And when you stand in that space, when you stop explaining yourself to people who will never understand you anyway, you become untouchable. That is what they fear more than anything. Your ability to move on without needing their approval ever again. Toxic people fear boundaries they cannot cross, because boundaries expose their limits and strip them of the control they crave. Every toxic individual feeds on access. They want to step into your emotions, your time, your energy, and your decisions without resistance. Boundaries are like walls that suddenly make their usual strategies ineffective. When you start setting boundaries, you're no longer accessible on demand. You're no longer available to be drained whenever they decide. And that terrifies them because toxic people thrive on your compliance. They need you to bend, to overextend, to break yourself in order to keep them comfortable. The moment you stop bending, the moment you put a line between what is acceptable and what is not, you've taken away the open door they depended on to control you. Most toxic people push against boundaries because they see them as restrictions to their power. If you say no, they'll guilt you. If you pull away, they'll chase harder. If you assert your limits, they'll accuse you of being selfish or uncaring. Why? Because boundaries are not something they want to respect. They're something they want to erase. And when you refuse to let them erase those boundaries, you expose them for what they really are. They can't manipulate you as easily. They can't shame you into submission. They can't twist the situation into making you feel wrong for protecting yourself. Boundaries create a barrier between their games and your peace, and that's why toxic people fear them more than anything. Think about how they react when you enforce a boundary. Suddenly, you become the villain in their story. You're the cold one, the one who changed, the one who doesn't care anymore. They say these things not because your boundaries are unfair, but because they hate losing access to the parts of you they exploited. They want unlimited access to your patience, your forgiveness, your energy, and your time. Boundaries shut the door on that access. They don't know how to exist in a space where you're not constantly available to them. That is why they fear boundaries. They take away their sense of entitlement over you. The power of boundaries lies in consistency. Toxic people are not afraid of boundaries that you set once and abandon. They're afraid of the ones you stand by, no matter how much they push back. Every time you stay firm, you send a message, I won't be moved. They test your limits because they hope you'll break. They expect that eventually, after enough pressure, guilt, or manipulation, you'll fold. But when you don't, when you prove through your actions that your boundaries are non-negotiable, that's when the fear sets in. They realize that no matter what they do, they cannot cross the line you've drawn, and that forces them to face the truth. They no longer have the power they once did. Boundaries also expose toxic people to themselves. When you create space, when you stop giving them unlimited access, they are forced to sit with their own emptiness. They can no longer distract themselves by pulling you into their drama or chaos. They can no longer use you as their emotional dumping ground. They are left to deal with themselves. And that's the one thing toxic people avoid at all costs. They fear silence, they fear being ignored, they fear being denied. Because all of those things force them to confront who they are without someone else to control. Boundaries make them face their own lack of power. And that's why they push against them so aggressively. When you set boundaries, you also reclaim your own sense of value. You're saying, I'm worth protecting. I'm worth rest. I'm worth peace. Toxic people despise this because it challenges the narrative they try to place on you, that you are only valuable when you are serving them. Boundaries disrupt that narrative. They force toxic people to see that you know your worth. And once you know it, they cannot reduce you back to someone who bends for their approval. That realization terrifies them because it means their grip on you is slipping. Boundaries are also powerful because they redefine relationships. Toxic people want relationships to be one-sided, where they take and you give, where they demand and you comply. Boundaries change the balance. They introduce equality into a space where control once existed. And toxic people fear equality because it means they no longer have the upper hand. It means they have to treat you with respect or risk losing access altogether. That shift in power dynamic is something they will fight against with everything they have. But if you stand strong, if you remain committed to protecting your space, they are forced to adapt or retreat. Either way, you win. Another reason toxic people fear boundaries is because boundaries are visible evidence of your growth. They show that you are no longer operating from fear, guilt, or insecurity. They show that you've learned from the past and that you refuse to repeat the same cycles. This growth threatens them because it means you are becoming someone they cannot manipulate. The stronger your boundaries, the stronger you become, and the weaker their influence grows. Toxic people don't just fear boundaries, they fear the strength you gain by setting them at the heart of it. Toxic people fear boundaries because they fear losing control. Control is their lifeline. It gives them significance. It feeds their ego. It keeps them from facing their own emptiness. Boundaries cut that lifeline. They remind them that no matter how loud they are, no matter how convincing they try to be, no matter how much they demand, you still have the power to say no. That single word, backed by firm boundaries, is more powerful than all their manipulation combined. And it terrifies them. The truth is, boundaries are not about pushing people away. They're about protecting your peace. They're not about being selfish. They're about being healthy. But toxic people will never see them that way, because for them, your boundaries represent the end of their influence. They represent the end of their easy access to your life. And that's why they fear them. Because once you draw that line, once you refuse to let anyone cross it, you show them something they never wanted to see. You're stronger than their control, and you're not going back. Toxic people fear when you stay unemotional because their entire game depends on your reactions. They thrive on pulling you into emotional chaos because the moment you react, they know they've got you. Whether it's anger, sadness, defensive, or even desperation, any emotional response tells them they still have influence over you. This is their leverage. They poke, they prod, they insult, they guilt trip, all to get a reaction. Because once you react, they can twist the story, they can manipulate the situation, and they can make you look like the unreasonable one. But when you stay calm, when you respond with silence or composure, you strip away their weapon. You show them that their attempts to provoke you don't work anymore. And that terrifies them because it means they've lost their control over your emotions. Think about it. Toxic people hate silence after they attack you. They hate it when their words don't sting the way they used to. They hate it when their accusations no longer make you jump into defense mode. Because the moment you stop reacting, their strategy fails. They feed on emotional energy like fuel. If they can't get you upset, if they can't make you feel guilty, if they can't make you angry, they're left powerless. That's why they escalate when you stay calm. They throw more words, harsher insults, louder tones. Because they're desperate to pull you into the storm. They can't stand the quiet strength of someone who refuses to engage emotionally. It's like holding up a mirror that shows them how weak their power really is. Remaining unemotional doesn't mean you don't care. It means you refuse to give them the satisfaction of controlling how you feel. This is not about shutting off your humanity, it's about discipline. It's about training yourself to recognize the trap and choosing not to step into it. Toxic people set emotional traps all the time. They bait you with guilt, with anger, with victimhood. They want to spark something inside of you that they can manipulate. But the moment you learn to recognize the bait and stay still, you win. They can no longer drag you into cycles of arguments or emotional exhaustion. You show them that your peace is not negotiable, and that realization scares them more than anything. Staying unemotional also reveals something. Toxic people don't want you to know your emotions are your power. They spend so much time trying to steal your emotional energy because they know it gives them leverage. When you're upset, you can be manipulated into apologizing for things you didn't do. When you're angry, you can be painted as the aggressor. When you're hurt, you can be convinced to forgive too quickly just to stop the pain. But when you're calm, none of those tactics work. Your decisions come from clarity, not chaos. Your words carry weight because they're not fueled by reactivity, and toxic people hate that because they know they can't twist clarity into something else. How they'll accuse you of being cold, heartless, or detached when you don't react. That's their fear talking. They try to shame you back into reacting because that's the only space where they feel powerful. They want you to believe that calmness is weakness, when in reality, it's the strongest position you can hold. To remain calm in the face of provocation is not indifference, it's mastery. And toxic people fear that mastery because it means you've elevated beyond their reach. They can scream, they can push, they can guilt, but they can't move you. They're left standing there, exposed, with their tactics failing. And that is a position they despise. The deeper truth is that toxic people fear the loss of emotional chaos because it exposes their own instability. When you remain calm, their behavior looks exactly as it is, uncontrolled, manipulative, and destructive. Without your emotional reaction to cover for them, their actions shine in the light for what they truly are. They can no longer spin the story because you haven't given them material to work with. Calmness reveals them. That's why they can't stand it when you stay quiet, measured, and composed. It forces them to sit with their own behavior instead of projecting it onto you. This kind of composure doesn't happen by accident. It's built through practice, through patience, through choosing over and over not to take the bait. It's not easy at first, because toxic people know your buttons. They know what to say to trigger you. They know the wounds to press on. But the more you practice staying calm, the stronger you become. The more you breathe, pause, and refuse to give in, the less power they hold. Eventually, you reach a point where their words don't even penetrate the way they used to. Their tactics become predictable, even boring, because you've detached their hooks from your emotions. And when you reach that level of discipline, toxic people fear you because you've become unshakable. When you're unshakable, you reclaim the power that was always yours. No one can dictate how you feel. No one can push you into anger or guilt without your permission. That's freedom, and it's the exact opposite of what toxic people want from you. They want dependency, emotional chaos, and control. They want to know that with a few words they can shift your entire mood. But when they see that no longer works, they panic. They realize they can't play their games with you anymore. And that fear drives them to either retreat or expose themselves further. Either way, you've already won. Remaining unemotional is not about being cold. It's about protecting your peace. It's about realizing that not every provocation deserves a response. Not every insult deserves your energy. Not every attack deserves your participation. The real strength is in restraint. The real power is in silence. And toxic people fear that silence because it starves them of the control they need. They can't manipulate a calm mind. They can't twist a measured response. And they can't dominate someone who refuses to give them the reaction they crave. That's why staying unemotional is the one thing they fear most, because it proves that their power over you is gone forever. Toxic people fear when you start valuing your boundaries because it means their access to you becomes limited. Boundaries are something they despise, because boundaries are walls that stop them from freely feeding on your time, your energy, your emotions, and your kindness. As long as you are boundaryless, you are easy to control. They can call whenever they want. They can push their problems onto you. They can demand your presence even when it drains you. And you will bend because you haven't yet built the discipline to say no. But the moment you begin to draw lines, the moment you begin to say, "This is not acceptable," or "This is not my responsibility," You take away their power. And that terrifies them because it means their hold over you weakens with every firm boundary you reinforce. Boundaries are more than rules. They are a declaration of your self-respect. They tell people how far they can go and what will not be tolerated. Toxic people, however, interpret boundaries as resistance. They see them as a threat because boundaries mean they can no longer manipulate you without consequences. Imagine someone who has been used to pushing you around, taking advantage of your silence, your guilt, or your kindness. Suddenly you say no. Suddenly you don't pick up the phone. Suddenly you don't show up for the drama. That's when their panic sets in. They will push harder. They will guilt trip you. They will accuse you of being selfish or uncaring because boundaries disrupt their access. It unsettles them because they realize the free ride is over. The truth is, toxic people survive off people who lack boundaries. They look for those who want to please, who avoid conflict, who will sacrifice their own peace just to keep others comfortable. They identify this weakness and exploit it. But the moment you stop playing into that dynamic, you begin to dismantle the system they've created around you. By valuing your boundaries, you begin to teach them that access to you is not free. It has conditions and it comes with limits. That scares them because deep down they know that without access to your time and energy, they lose their grip. It forces them to either change their behavior or lose their place in your life. Boundaries also expose toxic people for who they are. Because healthy people respect boundaries. They may not always like them, but they respect them. Toxic people, on the other hand, resist, complain, and rebel against them. So when you enforce a boundary and watch their reaction, you get to see the truth. Do they adapt and respect your limits, or do they attack and push harder? Either way, their reaction tells you everything. That's why toxic people fear boundaries. It reveals their true nature in front of you. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize that someone refuses to respect your limits, you start to recognize just how unhealthy their presence in your life is. But boundaries are not just about keeping others in check. They're about protecting yourself. They're about guarding your mental health, your energy, and your focus. Every time you enforce a boundary, you reinforce to yourself that your well-being matters. And toxic people fear that kind of self-respect. Because self-respect means they can no longer prey on your insecurities. They can no longer guilt you into saying yes when you want to say no. They can no longer convince you that you're selfish for taking care of yourself. Boundaries give you strength, and that strength removes the leverage they once had. It's important to understand that boundaries are not about controlling others. They're about controlling what you allow. You can't stop someone from trying to manipulate, but you can stop giving them access to you when they do. You can't control if someone lies, but you can control how much trust you extend after you've been shown their pattern. You can't control if someone insults you, but you can control whether you stay in that space and absorb it. That's what boundaries do. They give you control over yourself, not over others. And toxic people hate that because when you take control of yourself, you take away their ability to control you. At first, enforcing boundaries may feel uncomfortable. Toxic people will push back harder. They will make you feel guilty. They will accuse you of being difficult, of changing, of no longer caring. But that discomfort is not a sign that you're wrong. It's a sign that your boundaries are working. If they weren't, toxic people wouldn't react. They wouldn't fear them. The very fact that they resist is proof that you've drawn a line that protects you, and that line threatens their hold. Over time, the more consistent you are with your boundaries, the more they understand that their old ways no longer work with you. Some may leave because they don't want to adapt. And while it may sting at first, it's actually a blessing. Their exit is confirmation that they only valued you when you had no limits. When you live without boundaries, your life belongs to everyone else. But when you set boundaries, your life starts to belong to you again. You reclaim your schedule, your emotional energy, and your focus. You decide who gets access, how much access they get, and under what conditions. That kind of clarity builds peace, and peace is something toxic people cannot stand. They want chaos, they want control, they want access without accountability. Boundaries strip them of all of that, leaving them with only one choice: to either respect you or remove themselves. And that's why they fear your boundaries so deeply. It forces them to confront their own behavior, and it removes the comfort of having unrestricted power over you. Boundaries are the invisible armor that keep toxic people from draining you dry. They're not about building walls to shut everyone out. They're about building gates that only let the right people in. The moment you start valuing them, toxic people know their time is running out. They realize they can no longer manipulate you with guilt, fear, or obligation. They see that their tactics no longer work, and that recognition terrifies them. Because when you enforce boundaries, you finally step into the kind of power they can't touch, the power of self-respect, self-control, and self-protection. And toxic people fear nothing more than losing their ability to violate those things in your life. Toxic people fear when you finally stop giving them your attention, because attention is their lifeline. They survive on being noticed, being heard, being reacted to, and being the center of your emotional world. As long as you react, they know they still have power over you. Whether it is anger, frustration, tears, or even constant attempts to explain yourself, every ounce of energy you spend fuels them. They thrive when they can pull you into their chaos. But the moment you go silent, the moment you stop reacting, the moment you no longer feed their ego with your attention, you cut off their oxygen supply. This silence doesn't mean weakness. It means strength. It means you've chosen to conserve your energy rather than waste it on someone who only feeds off of your responses. And for toxic people, that silence is terrifying. They fear it because silence means you've shifted the balance of power. Instead of them controlling the narrative, your lack of reaction takes the script away from them. They can't provoke you anymore. They can't manipulate you with their words, and they can't get under your skin in the same way. Toxic people rely on drama to survive. Without drama, they wither. So when you deny them your attention, it exposes their dependence on chaos and forces them to sit with themselves. And that is their greatest fear, because it reveals just how empty they are without someone else fueling their need for control and validation. They are terrified of becoming irrelevant in your life, because irrelevance to them is like death. They will do anything to pull you back into the game, but your silence is a weapon they cannot fight. When you stop giving toxic people attention, you also protect your peace. You no longer let them dictate how your day feels, how your emotions flow, or how your energy is spent. You create space between their toxicity and your well-being. And in that space, you begin to heal. You begin to see that you don't need to defend yourself against every accusation. You don't need to justify your choices. And you don't need to explain your boundaries over and over again. Your silence becomes your declaration that their chaos no longer has power over you. This is why toxic people fear it. They know they can't reach you anymore the way they once did. They know they've lost access to your emotions. And without that access, their manipulation falls flat. Attention is a form of currency, and toxic people are greedy for it. They don't care if it's positive or negative, as long as they're getting it. If you praise them, they'll feed on it. If you fight with them, they'll feed on it. If you cry because of them, they'll feed on it. Every reaction keeps them relevant in your life. But when you stop paying them with your attention, they realize they can't afford to keep playing the same games. It terrifies them because your silence forces them to confront a reality they can't escape without your energy. They are nothing more than noise. And toxic people hate being ignored more than anything else. The fear of being ignored pushes them to escalate. They may try harder to provoke you. They may become louder, more dramatic, or more aggressive, because they desperately want to get a reaction. But this is where your strength matters. Every time you refuse to engage, every time you choose silence over argument, every time you walk away instead of explaining yourself, you grow stronger. And they grow weaker. They fear your ability to detach, because detachment means you've learned how to control yourself. It means you're no longer hooked by their words or trapped by their behavior. Detachment is power, and toxic people cannot stand the idea that they've lost that grip over you. Silence also reveals the truth about the relationship. If the only way they can feel significant is by provoking you, then your silence exposes their emptiness. Healthy people can handle space. They can handle quiet. They can handle not always being the center of attention. Toxic people, however, crumble in silence. It forces them to realize they are not as important to you as they believed. It makes them question their influence, their relevance, and their control. And nothing scares them more than losing control of someone they thought they owned. That's why silence is so powerful. It not only protects you but also shatters their illusion of dominance. When you stop giving them attention, you also reclaim your focus. Instead of constantly being dragged into their storms, you invest your energy into yourself. You grow, you heal, you build. And as you shift your focus inward, you become stronger in ways they can't manipulate anymore. This growth terrifies them because it means they are no longer the center of your life. They realize you no longer need them, and for someone toxic, being unneeded is the greatest fear. They thrive on dependency, and when you take that dependency away, you show them they never had real power. It was only borrowed from the attention you gave. It's important to understand that silence doesn't mean surrender. It doesn't mean letting them win. It means refusing to play a game that was designed for you to lose. Toxic people fear silence because silence means you've stepped out of their game entirely. You've created your own rules, and those rules protect your energy. They can't twist your words if you don't give them any. They can't escalate an argument if you don't argue back. They can't control your emotions if you refuse to hand them over. That's why they fear it. It takes away their greatest weapon, your reaction. So when you finally stop giving them attention, you break the cycle. You take away their ability to feed off of you, and you starve the toxicity. It won't be easy at first. They'll push harder, they'll test your silence, and they'll try to guilt you back into reacting. But the longer you remain calm, consistent, and firm, the more powerless they become. And that power shift is exactly what they fear most. Because once you stop giving them attention, you prove that they never had true control in the first place. You were the one holding it all along. And now you've chosen to use it in the only way that sets you free.